Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a high-stakes arena today. The rapidly escalating global trade turbulence that is currently gripping the European Union and the UK. Our focus is U.S. tariffs, but this isn't the standard macroeconomic discussion you might expect.
That's right. What started as tariffs on raw steel and aluminum intended by the U.S. to, well, revive its domestic industry and critically ring-fence it from high-volume Chinese imports, it's morphed into something far more ambiguous, far more expansive, and, frankly, utterly unpredictable for European manufacturers.
I think unpredictability is the key word here. Initially, these tariffs, which started at 25% and then jumped up to 50% back in June, were already a major issue. But to truly understand the current crisis, we really need to understand the mechanism the U.S. used to apply them, because that explains the chaos.
Absolutely. We need to start with the foundational policy. These are Section 232 tariffs. They're applied under the claim of national security risk. What's key for you listening is that because the U.S. uses this national security justification, these tariffs effectively bypass standard World Trade Organization rules and procedures.
Meaning they can be implemented swiftly, unilaterally.
Exactly, and often without clear warning or even clear expiration dates.
So the very premise of the tariff allows for this kind of policy instability, making it difficult for trading partners to challenge through, the conventional channels.
Precisely. And that lack of accountability is now being, well, weaponized through a term we are deep diving into today, the derivative product. Our mission here is to understand how this constantly expanding, ill-defined list creates just catastrophic uncertainty for every manufacturer, from heavy machinery producers right down to household goods suppliers all across Europe.
Catastrophic uncertainty seems like an apt description, especially when you consider what a derivative product now actually entails. It's no longer just about raw metal being shipped across the ocean.
The scale of enforcement has shifted entirely. Standard tariffs are measured by the weight or volume of primary goods, a ton of steel or a billet of aluminum. This new derivative policy targets products that simply contain steel or aluminum, even if it's just a tiny fractional component buried deep inside a finished good.
Right, and here is where the net gets cast incredibly wide. How wide are we talking? Give us a sense of the sheer administrative challenge this shift creates.
It captures virtually everything that rolls, spins, or, well, houses something. In August alone, the U.S. listed 407 product categories as these derivative inclusions. And to show the, you could almost say, absurdity of the range, consider the contrast. You have massive capital goods, things you would expect to be heavily impacted, like mobile cranes, huge bulldozers, rail cars, complex wind turbines.
Okay, those are major industrial products. Makes sense in a way.
Exactly. But then the list drags in completely mundane consumer goods. It includes things like office furniture, stainless steel sinks, and household items like kettles. The idea that a kettle could be swept up in a trade dispute supposedly intended to protect U.S. industry from national security threats posed by China is, frankly, it's mind-boggling for European producers.
The shift from auditing, say, a steel ingot, to auditing a complex wind turbine, a product with maybe thousands of components, is just exponentially more complex.
It is. And what's really fueling the anxiety in the European manufacturing sector is the ongoing process to expand this list even further. The U.S. opened a new consultation on September 15th with a really tight 2-week deadline, asking for input on what products should be included next.
And what's the prevailing sentiment from the EU steel industry about these consultations? Are they optimistic the list might actually be narrowed?
Not at all. They are convinced the consultation is clearly designed to expand, not to cut the list. This isn't viewed as some kind of stabilization measure. It's seen as a mechanism for perpetual expansion. And what makes this so destructive to planning is the stated intention to review this derivative list 3 times a year.
3 times a year. Wow. If you are a manufacturer, you simply can't commit to a 5-year capital investment plan if the cost inputs and tariff liabilities on your final product are fundamentally renegotiated every 4 months. That just destroys any kind of planning horizon.
It introduces regulatory paralysis, and that brings us directly to the perspective coming out of Europe's largest industry organizations. Luisa Santos, the Deputy Director General of Business Europe, that's the Confederation of European Industry, she summed it up perfectly. She called the trade relationship with the U.S. becoming quite turbulent.
Turbulent is a diplomatic word for what sounds like a severe policy headache. She argued this turbulence stems from the U.S. making a strange interpretation of the deals.
Yes. And that strange interpretation is what justifies the continuous expansion. The policy risk is that the unpredictability means basically anything could be hit next. She gave specific examples of just how vague the target can be. A motorbike that is now hit, or a table with a small bit of metal on it, or window frames, you see? These are finished consumer and commercial products that bear little resemblance to the raw material the tariff was originally designed to protect.
But wait a minute. If the policy goal was genuinely to block Chinese steel from entering the U.S. market, why are German and Italian factories belonging to established long-term allies taking the maximum regulatory and financial hit for this constantly moving target? How does the U.S. justify disrupting friendly supply chains in this way?
Well, that raises a huge geopolitical question, doesn't it? But within the current mechanism, the justification is simple. If your product contains any relevant steel or aluminum, regardless of where it came from, and it happens to be on the derivative list, it's subjected to the certification process. If you can't prove the origin or the exact content, the regulatory sledgehammer falls. Simple as that, unfortunately.
The consequence, as you mentioned earlier, is the death of certainty. When one side is continually creating new tariff buckets ad hoc year after year, the relationship is instantly destabilized. You just cannot forecast costs, and the confidence in the established policy framework evaporates. If you have one side expanding the scope constantly, it is, in Santos's words, very difficult to claim we have certainty.
And certainty, as we both know, is the absolute oxygen of long-term manufacturing investment. You can't have one without the other.
Okay, let's move now from the macro policy headache to the micro factory floor catastrophe that this rule creates. This is where the documentation challenge becomes absolutely chilling. We're talking about the specific challenge of certification and auditing.
Right. We really must look at the anecdote provided by Bernd Lange. He's the chair of the International Trade Committee at the European Parliament, a German MEP. He visited a German motorcycle factory, and the story he tells perfectly illustrates the sheer scale of the administrative burden we're talking about.
Tell us about the motorcycle factory's dilemma. What did he find?
Lange found that the factory owners were facing immense difficulty trying to produce a definitive, auditable paper trail for the exact quantity of steel and aluminum used in their vehicles. Think about a modern motorcycle. It's an incredibly complex machine, right? They needed to document components not just like the chassis or the engine block, but literally down to every single tiny nut, bolt, spring, and washer.
Because even that tiny component might contain a fractional element of, let's say, Chinese-sourced steel, which the U.S. is ostensibly trying to block through all this.
Exactly. Under the U.S. rules, the tariffs are payable only on the calculated value of the steel and aluminum content in the finished product. But when you are sourcing thousands of complex microcomponents from a decentralized global supply chain, calculating that exact percentage becomes, well, effectively impossible.
So what did the factory owners estimate their steel and aluminum content to be? Did they have a rough idea?
Lange reported their best guess was that the content was somewhere between 30% and 50% of the vehicle's total value. Now, that's a huge margin of error when you're talking about cost calculation for manufacturing.
A massive margin. And what did they actually declare in the end? Because they were unsure, what was their ultimate choice for customs?
They had to declare the maximum. They declared 50%. And this is the critical financial dilemma, the core of the problem for manufacturers. The factory owners stated clearly that non-declaration of all goods subject to duties puts them in danger of receiving customs penalties up to a staggering 200%.
Wait, 200%. If they simply fail to accurately calculate the steel content down to the last bolt, they don't just pay the tariff on the difference. They risk a penalty that is double the value of the duties owed. That completely dwarfs the cost of the steel itself.
That's the chilling part. The fear of that 200% customs penalty for non-compliance entirely dictates their behavior. It has to. Since proving the negative, that a tiny bolt doesn't contain targeted steel from a specific origin, is administratively impossible for complex products, they are forced to err on the side of maximum caution. So they declare the highest possible tariff percentage just to avoid regulatory obliteration.
That system seems almost designed to fail the manufacturer. The lack of perfect supply chain visibility combined with an extreme punitive penalty structure forces them to declare the highest possible tariff percentage, which of course crushes their profitability even if the actual content is far lower. It is, as Lange noted, extremely difficult to then explain to the workers that the overall trade deals with the U.S. are beneficial when they're paying these maximum punitive rates.
It creates a situation of regulatory paralysis, really. It forces companies to choose between two unacceptable options. risk a potentially catastrophic 200% penalty, or voluntarily pay the highest tariff rate, effectively wiping out their margins on those exports. The consequence is that the tariff becomes functionally punitive at its maximum rate, pretty much regardless of the actual content of the targeted material within the product.
So given this turbulence and the certification nightmare, how is the wider industry responding across Europe and also in the UK? Are we seeing unified action?
We certainly are. The UK specifically, they secured a slightly lower steel tariff rate of 25% compared to the EU's 50%. But even the UK government is urgently seeking clarification from Washington on which extra derivative steel products will be affected. They recognize the list expansion is probably inevitable.
And on the ground, the industry response seems galvanized. We've seen joint action from the Community Trade Union and British Steel. What are they specifically lobbying for?
Well, they're responding to what they term unprecedented challenges, citing existing global pressures like overcapacity and cheap foreign imports, which were already issues. They are seeking a domestic pledge to galvanize support for UK-made steel and reinforce the sector's resilience. The goal is long-term stability for the workforce and the essential infrastructure they sustain.
And across the EU, what is the stance of Eurofer? That's a powerful European steel trade representative body. Are they echoing similar concerns?
Their statement was incredibly strong. They argue that these chaotic developments make even more evident the need for a strong new trade measure. They believe the scope of the threat requires intervention that extends far beyond just protecting the steel sector itself.
Explain that. Why isn't this just about the steel sector anymore in their view?
Because the derivative mechanism targets finished products, their argument is that they need measures to preserve not only the viability of the EU steel sector, but, and I quote, EU manufacturing as a whole, unquote. They cite the millions of quality jobs sustained by these interconnected sectors across the continent. They view this expansive derivative list as an existential threat to the entire European industrial base's ability to compete globally.
So, zooming out, we started with an attempt by the U.S. to protect a domestic industry using a, let's say, controversial national security mechanism.
And what we ended up with is a system that imposes a technically complex, virtually impossible auditing and regulatory challenge on global manufacturers, many of whom are allies. The focus on these derivative products has resulted in continuous, ongoing, and technologically demanding supply chain auditing burdens for manufacturers pretty much everywhere.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the strategic thought we want to leave you, the listener, with. It's the sheer difficulty of proving the origin of a single component. That specific nut or bolt we talked about forces global companies, like that German motorcycle factory, to declare and pay tariffs at the absolute maximum 50% rate just to avoid that terrifying 200% penalty. Does that effectively make the entire trade deal functionally punitive, regardless of the actual amount of targeted steel used in the product?
It raises a profound question about the future of global supply chains, doesn't it? If this trend continues, demanding minute component-level certification for thousands of product categories, manufacturers are facing a serious strategic choice. Do they invest billions in, frankly, almost impossible supply chain visibility technology, or do they simply retreat? Do they reshore? What does this mean for the future of global sourcing if regulatory risk compels companies to localize production simply to avoid the auditing hazard?
The era of complex, optimized, globalized sourcing may be meeting its match in the form of the derivative tariff. Something to think about.